sisters took the lake house. Then the dead sorter moved by itself at midnight.
The attorney slid the envelope across the table as if it might leak. Mara did not touch it at first. The conference room still smelled like damp wool from the three of them shaking rain off their coats, and the window behind Lydia and June held a flat gray view of the parking lot where water pooled in the ruts beside the curb. The lawyer cleared his throat, tapped the deed packet, and said the Cranberry shed parcel had been assigned to Mara by default because it was the least liquid asset in the estate. Lydia had already taken the lake house keys from the tray near the coffee machine. June had already folded the spare set into her coat pocket. Their mother's handwriting was still on the probate inventory, but the paper felt far away from the room. Mara read the address on the deed once, then again. A collapsing shed on the edge of the bog. A structure no one had maintained for years. A place the others had called useless before the lawyer even finished speaking. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. You can contest it, Lydia said, though she was looking at the attorney, not at Mara. I'm not contesting anything, Mara said. June looked at her hands. Lydia gave a short laugh that had no warmth in it. Then, at least be practical. The shed is a liability. Mara slipped the deed into the pocket of her rain jacket. Practical had become a word people used when they wanted the poorest choice to sound like wisdom. She stood up before her sisters could turn the moment into a debate. No one followed her into the hall. No one offered the ride they had rehearsed over the last week as if generosity cost nothing. By dusk, she was driving alone down a sand road that narrowed between drowned cranberry beds and black cedar trunks. The storm had settled into a hard, patient rain, the kind that made every ditch shine and every low branch drip, as if the landscape were breathing through a wound. The shed appeared at the end of the road in a strip of dim light, a long, sagging shape on posts, gone crooked with a roofline that had sunk in the middle like a tired back. One side leaned toward the bog. The loading platform had split at the edge, and one plank hung down at an angle that looked one strong wind away from collapse. Mara parked beside a rusted gate and sat for a minute with both hands on the wheel. Her mother had once brought her here in late harvest season, years before illness and bills and all the small sharp losses that followed. Back then the place had smelled of wet vines, cedar dust, and berries split open under boots. Now it smelled like rot under tar paper. She slept in the car because the shed door would not close all the way, and the nearest motel was too far, too bright, and too expensive. The rain kept moving across the roof in thin metal fingers. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a sound so slight she thought it had come from the dream she was leaving. Not a bang, not a creak. A dry, deliberate shift of wood and chain from the direction of the shed. Mara sat up. The lot was almost black except for the low wash of the dashboard clock and the silver sheen of rain on the platform. She pushed the door open and stepped into mud up to her ankles. The shed window faced the road, one pane missing the others, fogged with age. Through the broken opening, she saw the sorting belt inside move forward by one slow notch. No motor ran. No light burned. The belt simply advanced a slat at a time, as if something heavy beneath it had changed its mind. Mara took 3 careful steps closer. Water dripped off the roof edge in steady lines. The inside of the shed was a blur of shadow and warped boards, but the belt had clearly moved. She heard it again, a low wooden click from somewhere deeper in the frame, followed by the soft patter of rain on tin. Nothing in the yard moved except the broken gate, which tapped once against its post. Line of hand-cranked rollers ran along one wall, and the sorting belt stretched down the center like a dead conveyor from another century. One side of the roof had leaked long enough to stain the floorboards dark. A gull had nested in the rafters at some point and abandoned a nest of twigs and wire insulation. Then Mara saw it. Near the center of this belt, resting on a slat as if placed there with care, sat one single cranberry, bright and wet and untouched. She did not know yet whether it had fallen from a gap in the roof or been carried there by something she could not explain. She only knew the shed had answered her in the dark and that whatever was moving inside it had chosen to leave her a sign. Mara started with the store because there was nowhere else to start. The swollen plank fought her shoulder until it gave way with a wet scrape, and then the morning air pushed into the shed, carrying the smell of bog water rust and old sugar from the berry stains ground into the floor. In daylight, the place looked worse than it had in the dark. The roof sagged over the north bay. One section of the wall had bowed inward just enough to pinch the line of a nail row. The belt frame ran down the center on iron brackets, but the lower rollers were crusted red with age. A cracked bin scale leaned against the far wall with its numbers half gone. Mara set the single cranberry from the belt on a clean bit of cardboard and let herself look, not just glance. There were 6 hand-painted sorting bins with faded tags, number 1, number 2, number 3, or 4, 5, number 6. A shallow shaker screen sat on a work table beneath a line of broken hooks. In the north corner, where the roof stain darkened the boards, a narrow channel had been cut into the floor and patched once with newer cedar than the rest. Somebody had cared enough to redirect water before somebody had stopped halfway. She knelt by the belt housing and touched the wood. It was dry on top and damp underneath. The slats had lifted by a fraction overnight enough to loosen one catch. That explained movement, maybe. Not the timing. Not the fact that the cranberry had been placed so deliberately. She followed the belt line toward the rear wall and stopped at a hand-sized pulley cover with a rusted latch bent nearly flat. The cover was sealed with old cedar wedges, each one driven in so tightly the grain had split around them. Not a repair. A concealment. A truck crunched up the sand road outside before she could pull the wedges free. Mara straightened too fast and struck the rafters with her head. She swore under her breath, then looked through the broken window. A white work truck had stopped beside the gate. The driver came around slowly, wiping rain from his cap with one hand. He was older than her by enough years to have a permanent stoop in his shoulders, but his eyes were clear and direct. He carried a toolbox in one hand and moved like a man who had spent his life carrying heavier things than tools. "You the one with the deed," he called. Mara opened the door halfway. "Depends who's asking. Cal Brewer. I fixed the sorter back when your mother's crew still ran berries through here." He tipped his chin toward the belt. "I heard somebody moved in." "That one moves by itself," Mara said. Cal glanced at the roof leak, the swollen wall, then the bent cedar wedges. He did not smile. "That's not the first thing I'd worry about." He stepped inside boots, leaving dark prints on the boards. Up close, he smelled like rain gear machine oil and peppermint gum. He crouched by the belt frame and ran 2 fingers under the lower run, careful not to disturb anything. Then he tapped the pulley housing, once listened, and nodded toward the north wall. "Your leak's feeding the tension change," he said. "Water's been working that frame for years, but this latch was sealed. Someone wanted the housing shut. Then you open it. Not until the belt is safe." He stood one hand on his lower back. "If the tension's still live, and that side rail gives, it'll bite hard. You need to brace the loading platform, get the roof water off the north bay, and clear the debris under the belt. Then I can tell you what else is in there." Before Mara could answer, her phone buzzed with a number she knew. Lydia. She let it ring once, then answered because ignoring her would only delay the same conversation. "Don't start," Mara said. "We saw the county notice," Lydia said. Her voice had the flat polish of someone trying not to sound nervous. "You don't have to be stubborn about this. The shed is a write-off. June and I are meeting a buyer this afternoon for the lake house parcel, and we can't keep stopping for your crisis." "It's not your crisis." A pause. Then, June farther from the phone, asking something Mara couldn't hear. Lydia came back on. "We're trying to help you be practical." Mara looked at the bent wedges in the housing. Practical again. The same word with different shoes. Then help by leaving me alone. She ended the call before Lydia could shape another argument. Cal had been politely staring out this broken window while she spoke, but his face told her he had heard enough to understand the shape of the family, if not the names. "They're selling something they shouldn't be able to sell," he said. "They think I'm supposed to be grateful for the shed." Cal gave a short nod. "People say that when they want you to confuse burden with value." By noon, the sky had opened to a cold mist. Mara found a ladder in the back lean-to, a stack of old tarps, and 2 rolls of roofing tape in a cabinet marked Flood Kit. She paid for them with the last cash in her wallet and did not look at the total twice. The hardware store clerk had a thumb with a permanent split at the knuckle and wrapped the tape with the concentration of a person handling something precious. Mara loaded the tarps in the back of her car, then returned to the shed with gloves, a pry bar, and 2 contractor bags for debris. Work began with water. She climbed the ladder and discovered the roof leak was not 1 leak, but 3. One tier ran along a seam where the tin had lifted. Another came through a rusted fastener. The worst poured from a narrow valley near the north edge, then dropped directly into the old channel on the floor below. That channel had been cut to move runoff away from the sorter. It was half blocked now by packed leaves and a broken nest. Mara cleared it with one gloved hand, and the next pulse of rainwater sank cleanly into the trough and disappeared under the wall. She froze there, crouched on the ladder, one boot on the rung, and one hand braced against the tin. The water should have collected in the floor channel and run toward the door. Instead, it dropped as if the wall itself were carrying it elsewhere. Mara climbed down, moved the ladder 2 feet to the left, and tested the floorboards beside the trough with the handle of the pry bar. One board answered with a hollow sound. Not all at once. A narrow section. She tapped again and heard water moving underneath, not above. Cal came over when she waved him in. He did not speak while she lifted the board. Beneath it lay a packed pocket of cedar chips, rust flakes, and old burlap. Under that, a shallow service run had been carved between 2 joists, and Cal looked once, then twice. "That's not a drainage fix," he said. "That's a rote." I used the pry bar to lift the edge of the wall trim just enough to see behind it. Water slid through a hidden trough and into a boxed cavity between studs. There was a faint smell there, not mold but dry paper sealed in wax long ago. Mara looked from the trough to the pulley housing, then to the cedar wedges. The shed was carrying water somewhere on purpose. The belt moving in the rain was no longer the strangest thing in the room. It was only the first sign that the old structure still had a working logic hidden under the decay. She set one hand on the warped wall and felt it vibrate with the next soft pass of rain. Mara did not touch the packet path yet. She spent the next hour making the shed less able to hurt them. Cal showed her how to drive 2 temporary braces under the loading platform with cut cedar blocks and a scrap of plywood wide enough to spread the weight. The platform had a slow sag to it, and every time Mara stepped near the outer edge, she could feel the boards answer under her boots with a soft, tired flex. Cal checked the angle, then nudged one brace with the toe of his boot until it sat true. "That'll hold for now," he said. "Long enough to work, not long enough to trust." Rain kept coming in a thin gray sheet, not hard enough to drown the yard, only steady enough to make every surface shine. Mara climbed the ladder again and patched the worst seam with roofing tape while Cal cleared the leaf sludge from the runoff channel below. When the water finally ran clean through the hidden trough and disappeared behind the wall, the belt frame gave a small inward shiver. Not a full movement this time, just enough to prove the system was still listening. She went back to the belt with a flashlight and a flat screwdriver. The lower frame had one section where the slats crossed over an iron shoe. Wedged under that shoe was a brass bin tag green with age and stamped in block letters "Reserve." The tag had 2 nail holes and a nick along one edge as if it had been tied and retied more than once before it slipped free and got trapped. Mara held it in her palm. It was heavier than it looked cool from the damp air, and the word on it made the back of her neck tighten. Reserve for what she asked. Cal leaned close enough to read it, then straightened slowly. "For people who needed the rest of the load more than the price tag did." Mara looked at him. He gave a small shrug, not a guess, more a memory he didn't want to overstate. "There used to be a cooperative pantry in town," he said. "The shed sorted the berries that went there, special runs. Repair crews, widows, families in a bad winter. I only saw the tail end of it." He stepped to the pulley housing and ran his hand over the cedar wedges without pulling them yet. "If your mother kept the old system alive, that tag may not be a throwaway." Mara slipped the brass tag into her jacket pocket and reached for the lower tension wheel. The wheel was set inside a cast-iron cradle, its teeth packed with dust and old grease. Cal handed her a rag and a small oil can from his toolbox. The metal felt unwilling at first, then loosened by a fraction as the oil spread through the dried grit. Mara worked the wheel one careful notch, then another. The belt answered with a soft wooden tap somewhere overhead, like a knuckle against a door. "Stop there," Cal said. The tension had shifted enough to change the sound in the frame. The belt was no longer dead weight. It was a long, latent thing, waiting on a release. Cal braced one hand against the side rail and used the screwdriver tip to lift the center cedar wedge in the housing. It did not move. He tried the second wedge. That one came out with a tiny crack of split wood. Moist air breathed from the seam behind the cover. Mara held the flashlight steady. The beam fell into a narrow cavity behind the pulley wall lined with wax paper and a strip of blackened cloth. Cal widened the opening just enough to get 2 fingers inside, then frowned. "There's more in here than paper," he said. He drew out a packet wrapped in waxed canvas flat and tied with faded twine. One corner had been rubbed smooth by years of pressure. The outside smelled faintly of cedar machine oil and the dusty wax used on old feed sacks. Mara took it with both hands as if it might tear if she handled it like property. Before she could untie the twine, the north wall gave a dull crack. Not a dramatic break, just a sharp internal sound like a beam shifting in a dry house. Mara and Cal both turned. The swollen boards above the hidden trough had bowed another inch, and a seam in the siding had opened enough to show a sliver of darkness between the studs. "Back up," Cal said. Mara moved one step away, but the sound came again lower this time, followed by a thin run of water where no water had been a minute earlier. It slipped from the upper cavity into the floor channel with a quick, startling hiss. The shed was changing shape around the hidden root old wood, settling in slow increments under the rain load. Cal crossed to the wall and pressed his palm flat against the siding. "That cavity's been holding moisture longer than it should. If we open the packet while the wall's working, we could lose both." Mara looked from the packet to the seam in the wall and then to the belt line above them. Her fingers tightened on the canvas. For a moment she thought about her sisters in town, about the lake house keys and the polished language of practical decisions, and about how easy it had been for everybody to speak of this place as if it were only broken lumber. The packet in her hands felt heavier than that. "So we stop?" she asked. "No," Cal said. "We choose the safer stop." He fetched a shallow metal tray from the workbench and laid it on a clear section of floor away from the wall. Mara set the packet there. Cal covered the opening in the housing with a clean rag and a temporary board cut from a broken shelving plank. He did not try to force the hidden compartment wider. He simply marked the edges with pencil and measured the seam distance with his tape. "Your mother knew what she was doing," he said quietly. "A hit and run like that only makes sense if somebody meant to protect what was inside from damp and from casual hands." Mara knelt beside the tray. The packet had one faded stitch line across the top and a small brass ring tied through the twine, the kind used to hang inventory tags. The shape under the canvas was flat and rectangular, not a box, not a... At the far end of the shed, one of the old sorting bins gave a tiny clack as the belt settled back into place. Mara looked at the reserve tag in her pocket, then at the sealed packet on the tray. The title of the place, the scale of the work, the cracked wall, the hidden water route, the deliberate label. All of it began to feel less like a mystery and more like a structure built around a duty that had outlived the people who last understood it. She did not know yet what the canvas contained. She only knew it had been stored with care, and that her mother had hidden it in a place where no one would find it by accident. Outside, the rain brightened for a moment, striking the tin roof in a higher, faster pattern. Inside, Mara kept her hand on the packet and waited for the wall to settle. Mara waited until the rain eased to a steadier patter and the wall stopped making those small internal clicks. Only then did she slide the waxed canvas packet into her lap and work the twine loose. The knot had flattened with age, but it still held the shape of careful hands. When it gave way, the waxed canvas opened with a dry crack, like old leather folded and unfolded one time too many. Inside were two things. The first was a ledger bound in thin green cloth that had browned at the corners. The second was a stack of letters tied with red cotton thread, folded into narrow rectangles and sealed with scraps of tape long gone yellow. Mara lifted the ledger first because it felt heavier, and because the paper inside had the scent of storage and cedar and something faintly sweet like dried fruit kept in a dark jar. Cal set his toolbox on the workbench and did not speak. He stood with his hands on his hips, letting her read. The ledger cover had no title on the outside, only a penciled line at the top of the first page, sorter reserve. Beneath it were columns ruled by hand: date, bin count, reserve weight, destination, initials. The first entries were ordinary enough: October loading, November sorting, December holdback. Then the destinations changed. Not market routes, not bulk shipment numbers, names. Mara traced one line with her fingertip: E. Bell 12 LB Pantry. Another: J. Sloan 9 LB Stove Repair. Then RNA is 15 LB Winter School Sack. The handwriting was neat but tired the pressure of the pen going uneven whenever the writer had paused. Some pages carried ink smudges where a thumb had dragged through still wet notes. Others had small additions tucked into the margins: extra potatoes from the north bed, 2 crates for the mill hand with the burned arm, half a barrel set aside after the freeze. Mara turned a page and found a different hand, older and slanting left. Her grandmother's, maybe. The entries here had more detail and less formality. Families came to the shed in snow, sometimes after dark. The reserve was measured by Need Not by Charity Theater. One page listed a storm week when the road iced over, and a delivery boy had to sleep in the sorting room because he could not cross the bog before dawn. Cal nodded once at the page without touching it. That's what I remember hearing. No speeches. Just work. Mara kept reading until the ledger shifted in her hands and a folded letter slid free from the back cover. It was addressed in blue pencil to her mother, then crossed out and readdressed to no one. The first line made Mara stop breathing for a second. If the shed ever comes to your daughter, let her read this before anyone tells her it was only a ruin. She set the ledger down carefully and unfolded the letter. The paper had stiffened in the fold lines, but the writing was still clear. Her grandmother had written with a steadier hand than the ledger keeper, though the letters carried the strain of someone composing fast by lamplight. The letters were not dramatic, they were plain enough to sting. One explained that the shed had been built as a sorting house, but the reserve run had become a promise after the mill layoffs and the winter before the flood. When the cooperative folded, the families who had depended on the reserve were too scattered, too embarrassed, or too proud to ask for help directly. So the food was still set aside in quiet ways, then delivered where it was needed. Not forever, just until the town learned to carry its own people again. Another letter named Mara's mother as a child. Mara read the line twice before it settled. Your mother stood in that doorway in boots too big for her, and carried a sack home for her own mother when the pipes froze and the stove went out. She never forgot that winter. She said the shed was the only place that did not make the poor explain themselves. The room seemed to narrow around that sentence. Mara looked up from the paper and stared at the plank wall as if the boards might confirm what the letter had already said. Her mother had never spoken of that winter with any detail. She had talked around hardship the way careful people do, leaving the center of it untouched. Mara had thought the shed was an inconvenience inherited through bad timing. Now it felt like a held breath. Cal reached for a rag and wiped his glasses. He was giving her a private minute without saying so. Mara unfolded the next letter. It was shorter, and the ink had bled where damp had touched one corner. The writer had instructed that the parcel should remain with the property even if the estate changed hands. The shed was not to be emptied before the reserve obligation was settled. The land taxes had been kept current by Mara's mother for the same reason the roof had been patched and the wall channel kept open. The place was not sentimental. It was guarded. Your mother paid for this, Mara said, and heard the surprise in her own voice. Cal looked at the ledger, then at her. She kept it from getting stripped. Why didn't she tell me? He gave a small, practical lift of one shoulder. Maybe she wanted the place to survive her, not the story around it. Mara turned another page in the ledger and found the recent years. The reserve run had thinned. Some entries were crossed out. Some showed no destination at all, only weights and initials, as if the work had become harder to name once the cooperative ended. But the final entries, the ones written in her mother's hand, were still there. She had paid for roof tar cedar braces, a new latch, and a winter delivery of flour. She had never stopped the system. She had only hidden how close it came to ending. Mara leaned back on her heels. The packet had not held money or scandal or any of the simple dramas people like to assume lived inside old buildings. It held responsibility recorded by hand and kept alive through embarrassed years. The loneliness of it landed differently now. Her family had been arguing over value while her mother had been guarding obligation. June's voice came back to her in fragments: practical, liability, fast sale. Mara looked at the brass reserve tag in her pocket and then at the names on the page. The tag had not been a clue in the treasure sense. It was an instruction, a reminder that the shed's value was measured in the people it had once kept from going hungry, and in the work still unfinished around it. She read one more line at the bottom of the last letter and had to pause there. It was not a confession, it was a request. If this comes to Mara, do not let her think she was left the broken thing by mistake. Leaking, now not wandering, moving where it had been led to go. Mara closed the ledger halfway, then opened it again to the first page as if she needed to prove the words would still be there. Cal was still standing near the doorway, respectful and still, his boots tracking a crescent of mud on the floorboards. He had not tried to read over her shoulder. He waited until she looked up. "We should log what's in the wall cavity before the weather changes again," he said. Mara nodded, but she kept one finger on the page marked Sorter Reserve. Through the broken window, the gray light had shifted, and for the first time all day the shed smelled less like rot than like wet cedar and old paper kept safe from ruin by stubborn hands. The town office smelled like toner-wet coats and the dry paper dust that rises from old file cabinets when they have been opened after a long sleep. Mara carried the ledger in both hands as if the building itself might ask for proof. Annika Reyes looked up from a stack of permit folders, took one look at the mud on Mara's boots, and slid a legal pad aside to make room. "You found the shed packet," Annika said. "I found the packet," Mara said. "I'm looking for the rest." Annika did not ask for the dramatic version. She asked for the parcel number, the date on the deed, and whether Mara had the original probate inventory. When Mara laid the ledger on the counter, Annika stopped writing and turned the first page with the careful fingers of someone who respected paper that had survived on purpose. "This is not decorative family history," she said after a minute. "This is an obligation record." She left Mara standing by the counter and went into the back room where the deed books lived in long grayed drawers. The copier made a flat mechanical hum. Out through the front window the rain had gone thin and white over the parking lot. A truck rolled past with a bed full of fence posts and vanished behind the maples. When Annika returned, she carried a folded plat map with a red grease pencil circle around the shed parcel and a second sheet with notes from a land use file. "Your mother kept a payment trail on the taxes," she said. "And there's an older restriction here that was never fully cleared from the cooperative closure. Not a clean sale problem, a use problem." Mara looked up, meaning somebody treated the property like an ordinary outlot after it stopped being ordinary. Annika tapped the paper once, but the reserve function was part of the parcel history. If that never got formally discharged, the county should not have let anyone talk about a quick transfer, like it was simple. Mara folded her arms on the counter edge and felt the ledger under her elbow. "So my sisters can't just unload it." "Not cleanly," Annika said. "Not if these records hold up." That was enough to make Mara stand very still. Not relief, not victory. Just the first real proof that her mother had not been clinging to a ruin for sentiment. She had been maintaining a duty the town had let grow quiet. Lydia called twice before Mara answered. On the third ring, June's name flashed instead, and Mara took the call because the office was too quiet to absorb an argument gracefully. "We're at the lake house," Lydia said without greeting. "The buyer is here. June thinks you're creating a mess because you don't want to sign." Mara looked at the deed copies spread on Anika's desk. "I'm creating a pause." "A what?" "A pause. The shed isn't disposable and you know it now." June came on in the background asking for the phone, then stopping herself. Lydia lowered her voice. "You have one habit, Mara. You turn every hard thing into a cause." "No," Mara said. "I turn every ignored thing into a job." That landed somewhere close to silence. Then June took the phone after a rustle of fabric. Her voice was quieter, less polished than Lydia's. "If this turns into legal trouble, we can't carry it." You already carried the easy part, Mara said. Lydia cut back in sharp this time. Don't do that. We got the lake house because that was what mattered. Mara looked through the office window at a county plow parked by the curb, its orange blade beaded with rain. That's what you were told mattered. The line went still. Not broken, just heavy. When the call ended, Mara set the phone face down and noticed her own hands were steady. That surprised her more than the argument. She had expected anger to shake loose some smaller, more helpless version of herself. Instead, it seemed to be making room. Annika looked up from the copier. Family, sisters. Annika nodded once in the brief professional way of people who have seen enough estates to know grief does not arrive alone. Then bring them the records, not the feeling. Feeling will only give them a place to stand against you. Mara picked up the copied plat map and slid it into the ledger cover. Outside, the rain began again with a harder sound on the courthouse steps. Back at the shed, Cal had already started before she returned. He had cut a pair of new cedar blocks to match the angle of the loading platform and hammered them under the worst soft spot, then swept sawdust out of the braceline with the side of his hand. The work had changed the shed's posture by a degree or two. It still looked old, but less likely to fail in a single breath. Good timing, he said. The right side was starting to argue. Mara set the records on a dry crate and climbed to the sorter table with a flashlight. Cal stayed below, marking the locations of loose boards with chalk. They worked in a rhythm that needed no conversation. Mara lifted one broken bin tag, wiped the rust from its edge, and found a number penciled on the back. Cal checked the underside of the rail and found 3 more tags wired together with baling wire and tucked where the knee could not easily see them. Numbers. Repair runs. Winter sacks. The old system had been organized in layers, not left in a heap. Under the inspection rail, Mara found carved initials no one had bothered to sand away, M.E., over and over, then smaller marks beside them, a line of childish scratches with a date from decades ago. She held the flashlight low and saw more marks near the end of the rail. Tiny, hand-cut names grouped together in the same cramped space. Kids used to wait here, Cal said when he saw her looking. Why? Because somebody was always counting and somebody else was always distributing. The rail was where they stood until their bags were ready. Mara touched the carved letters without pressing hard. The wood was smooth in the grooves from years of fingers sliding over it. She looked at the belt frame, the patched roof seam, the hidden trough, the ledger on the crate behind her. None of it wanted spectacle. It wanted order. Together, they emptied the lower cabinet, sorted the surviving brass tags into a biscuit tin, and pulled 3 boards from the rear wall where the grain had started to cup. The boards came free with a sound like a slow breath leaving a tired chest. Behind them was dry insulation, a strip of black tar paper, and a hand-marked repair note in pencil, water first, then belt. Mara held the note while Cal set another brace in place. It was the first handwriting she had seen in the shed that did not belong to the ledger or the letters. Someone had been planning the repair sequence years before them, and they had planned it correctly. Annika called just before dark. Mara put the phone on speaker so Cal could hear while he tightened a bolt on the platform brace. I found the clause, Annika said. It took longer because it was filed under cooperative disposition instead of easement language. That's why nobody noticed it in the estate summary. Mara glanced at the ledger, then at the wall note. What does it say? That the parcel cannot be sold free and clear until the reserve obligation is formally resolved. Food right duties, delivery history, and remaining land tax protection all travel with the property unless a hearing clears them. Cal gave a quiet, almost satisfied grunt. Mara closed her eyes for a second and let the words land exactly as they were. No miracle, no punishment, just the law catching up to the shape of the place. Can Lydia and June force a sale anyway? Mara asked. Mara looked at the wall cavity, now patched and measured, and saw her mother's work in a new light. Not secrecy. Protection. Annika paused, then added, I printed the clause and the relevant plat notes. I'm leaving them in the night box for pickup. When Mara hung up, she and Cal stood over the crate while the copier paper, still warm from the office, lay under a desk lamp, the black letters crisp against the white sheet. The clause sat at the top of the page with a county stamp in the corner and a red hand-drawn circle around the line that mattered. Mara kept her palm flat on the paper until the ink cooled, then lifted it carefully and set it beside the ledger as the shed settled around them in the rain. The next morning, Mara came back with coffee she had not really budgeted for and a small roll of painter's tape to mark the work that still needed doing. Cal was already there, bent over the inspection rail with a chisel handle in one hand and the ledger page propped on a crate beside him. He had found the old pencil marks under the sorter table and cleaned the dust from the grooves without widening them. Mara set the coffee on the bench and crouched beside the rail. The carved initials were older than the current boards, but the cuts were still sharp enough to feel with a fingertip. In among the lines of M.E., she found a smaller set of initials she had missed the day before, scratched almost under the lip of the wood. 3 letters, a date, a tiny triangle mark beside it like a note somebody would recognize years later. "Those are family marks?" she asked. Cal shook his head. "No. Customers, kids, people waiting with their names in a bag somewhere else." Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the line of tags in the biscuit tin. The shed had not only sorted berries, it had sorted need into a system small enough for one town to carry. The thought made the work in front of her feel less like repair and more like restoration of a missing promise. She spent the rest of the morning washing the sorter table with warm water and a scrub brush, careful not to over-soak the warped wood. Under the grime, the grain came up pale and honest. A second inscription emerged near the end of the table, not carved, but inked under a layer of shellac, "Pay only what you can. Leave the rest." Mara read it twice. The sentence was too plain to be sentimental and too old to be invented for comfort. It sat there like a rule. She carried the old brass tags to the sunlit door and rubbed each one with a rag until the lettering showed again. The numbers were not valuable on their own. Their weight came from the way they had been used. While she worked, Cal measured the distance between the wall studs and wrote it in pencil on a scrap of cardboard. "You're going to need new siding there," he said. "Not all at once. One panel at a time." Mara nodded. She knew that now. The shed did not want a dramatic rescue. It wanted ordered attention, the kind that starts with the parts most likely to fail and works outward. Water, structure, load, then the rest. By noon, Mara had moved all the preserved ledger materials into a dry plastic bin lined with old towels. She photographed the pages for backup not because she wanted digital copies to replace the paper, but because the paper had already been asked too much. When she slid the camera back into her bag, she caught herself looking at the tidy stack of records as if they were a hearth. A truck door slammed outside. Lydia and June had arrived. They did not come in together. Lydia came first, stepping carefully around the mud, as if the shed itself might stain her. June followed with a grocery bag in one hand and an expression that made her look younger than Mara remembered. Neither of them spoke for a moment. They looked at the braced platform, the clean table, the tarp patched over the roof seam, and the ledger bin on the crate. Lydia recovered first. "You've turned it into a campsite." "It was already a campsite," Mara said. "I just added tools." June set the grocery bag on the bench. Inside were sandwiches, a paper box of tea, and a packet of clean bandages. She did not explain why she brought them. She only touched the edge of the ledger bin with 2 fingers and then withdrew her hand as if the paper might have teeth. Lydia looked at the printout from Anika that was pinned under a clip on the wall. "So, this is real?" "Yes." "Then why didn't Mom tell us?" Mara kept her eyes on the tags in the tin. "Maybe because you only asked about value." Lydia's jaw tightened. For one sharp second, Mara expected the old family script to begin again, each sister picking a side before the facts had settled. Instead, June pulled out one sandwich, unwrapped half of it, and held it in both hands without eating. "We thought you were taking the worst part on purpose," June said. Mara gave a short laugh that was not kind and not cruel, just tired. "You left me the worst part. That's not the same thing." It felt the same. The room went quiet. Rainwater moved through the hidden trough behind the wall with a thin, steady sound that made the silence harder to carry. Lydia looked away first. Then, unexpectedly, she reached for the county paper and read it line by line. Her face changed only a little, but enough for Mara to see that the neat story Lydia had been telling herself could not survive the print. This means the sale isn't simple, Lydia said. No, Mara said. It means it was never simple. June sat on an empty crate. She unwrapped the bandages and placed them beside the coffee. Can we fix it with you? She asked, and the question landed without decoration. Mara looked at her sisters, not at the old versions of them she had been carrying around in anger, but at the present women in damp shoes who had come back to the shed and stood in it without pretending it was a useless place. That did not erase anything. It only made room for a different kind of conversation. Yes, Mara said, but not by selling first and apologizing later. Lydia nodded once, stiffly, as if agreement itself required good posture. Then, tell us what needs doing. Mara handed her the broom. The storm came in again that afternoon with a heavier wind enough to shake the loosened tarps and snap the edge of one roof flap like a flag. Mara was halfway through resecuring the north seam when the sound changed. Not louder, sharper. She heard the first crack before she understood it was the wall shifting under wet pressure. Cal shouted from below, off the ladder. Mara came down 2 steps at a time. The upper siding over the hidden trough had started to bow outward. One of the temporary braces had settled an inch too far, not enough to fail, but enough to put stress back into the wall run. June grabbed the end of the tarp while Lydia braced the ladder feet in the mud. Mara did not panic. The record work had changed that part of her. She looked at the wall, the water path, the brace, and the wind direction. All at once, then moved the ladder farther left and climbed again with the roofer's tape in her mouth. Cal handed her a fresh cedar shim and kept one hand under the tarp to catch any falling debris. Together, they shifted the drain path just enough to relieve the pressure. The siding gave one more groan, then settled. Now, Cal said. Mara drove the shim home with the heel of her palm. June passed up the extra board. Lydia, who had been trying not to get her coat dirty, finally stopped caring and held the ladder steady with both hands in the rain. The 3 of them worked in a wet, awkward rhythm that would have been impossible a day earlier. The wall did not become beautiful. It became safe. When the wind eased, Mara climbed down and found a pencil mark on the exposed joist where her grandmother had once written the words, "Water first," then "belt." She had seen the note before, but now it meant more than sequence. It meant survival was procedural. It happened in order. It happened with help. June sat on the crate soaked through and laughed once under her breath. I can't believe I'm saying this, but this place is starting to make sense. Lydia wiped rain from her face with the back of her wrist. I hate that you're right. Mara almost smiled. Not because everything was healed. Because the shed had finally forced honesty into the room without needing anyone to win. By evening, the storm had moved east, leaving the bog dark and reflective under a low strip of cloud. The shed smelled of wet cedar clean dust and the faint mineral trace of rain drying on tin. Mara lit one work lamp and stood with her sisters and Cal around the ledger bin one last time before closing up. The county paper lay flat beside the books. The reserve tag sat on the bench. The old brass tags had been sorted by number and use. Anika called to say the hearing could be set for the following week if Mara wanted the reserve record formally entered. Mara looked at the bin, then at her sisters. Yes, she said, set it. Lydia opened her mouth, then closed it again. For once, she did not try to steer the moment. June nodded, already reaching for her keys, as if practical help had become easier than argument. Cal locked the tool chest and tucked the last 2 cedar shims into his jacket pocket. You've got enough here to keep working through winter, he said, but only if you keep the roof watched and the water moving. I know, Mara said. He glanced once at the ledger. And if the town gives you a fair hearing, this place might not stay a private burden. Mara understood what he meant. The shed could become what it had always been at its best, a small working place with a duty larger than one family. Not charity. Not a museum, a use. When her sisters left, they did not leave in triumph or shame. They left with copies of the record and the first honest knowledge they had brought to the shed in years. Mara stayed behind a few minutes longer, listening to the last rainwater thread through the hidden trough and into the drain run. The sound was soft, now controlled almost ordinary. She put her hand on the sorter table, then on the ledger cover, then on the cold metal rim of the bin tin. The room did not feel rescued. It felt accountable. The next week would bring hearings, more repairs, and a long list of small tasks. Tonight was enough. The shed had stopped bleeding water, the records were safe. The duty had names. Mara turned off the work lamp and stood in the dark doorway looking out over the bog where the cranberry beds shone black and red under the clearing sky. Spring came late and mild, the kind of spring that did not hurry itself. The cranberry vines pushed new green over the bog beds, and the shed held through the thaw without another wall failure. Mara replaced the worst boards one at a time, exactly as Cal had shown her, and kept the drainage channel clear after every heavy rain. The roof still had one patched seam visible from the road, but the place no longer looked like it was waiting to collapse. It looked occupied by purpose. The county hearing did not become a spectacle. That suited Mara. The reserve clause was entered. The parcel restriction was acknowledged. The food right obligation was not erased. It was formalized into a small, workable agreement that let the shed remain with Mara, while keeping the old reserve duty alive in a modern form. Not everything from the ledger could be restored exactly as it had been, but enough could. Lydia came once a month with supplies she did not announce in advance. June learned how to stack boxes without crushing the bottoms. They still disagreed with Mara, sometimes sharply, but the shed had given them a language that did not require pretending. They had to work around one another, and that changed them more than apologies would have. Cal showed Mara how to replace the belt slats in sections, how to oil the bearing housing without flooding the wood, how to listen for the rhythm that meant the frame was carrying weight evenly. He never turned the place into his project. He gave her the methods and stepped back. By the time the first real reserve sorting day arrived, Mara could but only after she had cleaned and re-numbered them. The ledger stayed on a dry shelf in its plastic bin, opened for reference, not for display. On the first warm evening of May, Mara stood in the doorway with the ledger under one arm and watched the last family leave with their boxes balanced against the wind. The children were ahead of them, running over the packed sand road toward the parking lot, their shoes lifting little bursts of dust. Behind them, the shed sat quiet, its roofline level, its wall dry, its door hanging square in the frame. Her mother had not left her a broken thing by mistake. She had left her a place where care still meant something. Mara turned off the lamp, locked the door, and walked home along the bog road with the dusk on her shoulders.